How do? My name is Andrew Hancock and I am a VMware technical architect from Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. I have worked with VMware since their birth in 1998, so that has been over 24 years I've been working with the VMware product catalogue. Some of my close colleagues may say, if you cut Andy in half these days, it reads VMware like a stick of rock from Blackpool Pleasure Beach. I have now written 130 articles and recorded 10 hours of VMware vSphere videos for Experts Exchange and received 41 Experts Exchange awards over the last 10 years working with the Experts Exchange community. I am currently the overall #1 point earner in the Hall of Fame at Experts Exchange. I am honoured to have been accepted into the VMware vExpert program since 2011 and more recently a VMware vExpert Pro for the last 3 years. Welcome back and welcome to another Hancock's VMware half hour. Well, hopefully it's not going to be 30 minutes at all. Hopefully it's going to be about 10 minutes, a short one. I was out with the bees earlier and I got stung, hence why my hair's held back in a ponytail because it's a bit long in a bee suit. And I was thinking about the next lot of videos that I'm going to do. I'm going to start getting into storage and vMotions and iSCSI and NFS and NASes and things like that. And we need to do all this really because if we're going to look at vMotion and clusters and HA and EVC and vSphere DRS, then we need to have something called shared storage. And currently, if you've looked at the previous videos that I've done, we've been really concentrating on a single ESX host with local storage only. So now we're actually going to bring in some shared storage into this. And I was thinking to myself whilst I was over the bees and getting stung, okay, what better way to bring into our lab a virtual NAS? So I've been looking at virtualizing the Synology product, the Synology NAS. And I've actually, after a number of days, I've managed to virtualize a Synology NAS using running DSM 7.1. Now that's actually currently in our main lab here, not on the EE Training Center lab. So I thought, well, what a better way of actually showing you how we can use a new feature in vSphere 7, not so new anymore. And we've been using a fling to do this for a while. And that fling has now actually been incorporated specifically into vSphere 7. And it's called cross vMotion. So you're able to migrate virtual machines from one vCenter server to another vCenter server that are not currently connected in any way in enhanced link mode or anything like that. There are options to do that. Clearly the criteria to do this is that both vCenter servers and their hosts must be able to communicate with each other. So you must be able basically to, from one vCenter server, it must be able to communicate with the other vCenter server. Now here in the lab, the EE Training Center lab is actually on a separate network here, which is split across the router from our main lab. So that gives us a little bit of a headache, but all that's really handled by the router itself, so it's reachable. So from one lab to the other lab it is actually reachable, and the firewalls are in place to do that. And I'll give you an example and I'll show you how to check this. And the hosts must be able to reach each other. Now what's important about the hosts is the VM kernel port group adapter must be able to reach. So I've got a couple of SSH sessions and I'm going to try and keep this short and I'm going to try and keep it to 10 minutes. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time here on my stopwatch. So the way that we have our labs here, we have odd and even labs. So our main lab is on even hosts, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. And our EE data center lab is on odds, 1, 3, 5, 7. You get the sort of idea. So ESXi 008 is where currently the virtual machine that we want to migrate, vNAS build, sits on. And ESXi 007 is the host that we've been working with. It's our trusty old Dell PowerEdge R730. So we have a VMware kernel adapter on our ESXi 007, which is 192.168.182.103, and we have a VMware kernel adapter on our ESXi 008 host, which is 141.245.138.106. Now we can use the magic ping to actually confirm that we've actually got connectivity between ESXi 007 and ESXi 008, although these are on completely different networks, and all the heavy lifting and the routing is actually done by a main router that we have on site that's routing between these two networks, and there's a firewall in place as well, and we've got all the rules correctly set up. So that just proves here by using ping that we can actually, those two VM kernel adapters which the vMotion traffic is going to pass through can communicate with one another. What's more important is something called vMkping. Now vMkping is a special version of ping which actually sends the data through the VM kernel port group, and we can actually specify as well by using, I'll put all these vMkping. So vMkping-I followed by the VM kernel number, in this case vmk1, followed by the IP address, actually sends the traffic through that VM kernel port group. So that confirms there that ESXi 007 can communicate with ESXi 008 through that port group vmk1, that VM kernel port group 1. And we'll do exactly the same on our other host, vmkping-I, vmk0, followed by the IP address. So there are a few questions that come up on Experts Exchange when people basically are struggling with vMotion, and the simple solution to check is to use vMkping. Very, very simple. By actually specifying the VM kernel adapter that you want to send the traffic through, you can very quickly determine whether or not that those two hosts can communicate. So there's nothing wrong with our network communication between our two vCenter servers and our ESXi hosts. So I'm done with SSH, and I've showed you how to open up SSH back in the early videos, video 3 I think it was. I'll put that link in the article description as well. So I'm going to basically, this is actually connected to another vCenter server. This is just vCenter, which basically runs another lab here in the office. And quite simply, I'm going to select migrate. Now, VMware doesn't call it vMotion or live migration within the menu. It actually basically calls it migrate. And I suppose as vExperts, we sort of kind of regard a vMotion, which is a VMware term, a patented VMware term. A vMotion is a live migration between, it could be compute or it could be storage, but it's the live migration of a virtual machine in real time with no downtime, i.e. hot. The machine's actually powered up. If the machine's off, we don't necessarily call it a vMotion, we really call it a cold migration if the machine's powered off. So I'm going to click migrate, and you may notice here under the very last option we've got cross vCenter server export. Migrate the virtual machines to a vCenter server not linked to the current SSO domain. So these are two standalone vCenter servers that we have here. Now I'm going to want to keep the virtual machine on our existing lab so I can experiment with it later. If you were doing this in the live in production, then basically you would want to basically migrate it completely. So I'm going to just tick that box, say keep it on the source, and this is just going to perform a clone operation, followed by next. I'm going to type in vCenter server 7, and I'm going to specify Just going to put the password in. You could save it, the address, for future reference, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to click login. Okay, so apologies for Dashlane, I thought I'd got rid of that. Okay, so we have successfully connected to vCenter Server 7, and this is our vCenter Server 7 here, remember? This is the one that we've been working on in the lab here. And I'm going to click next. And I'm going to trick the EE Training Data Center, and it wants me to select a host. So we've only got one host. Now, whoops, now I've deliberately knew this was going to occur, and I wanted to show you because this is a question that often comes up. We're seeing lots of questions coming up now because organizations are putting in lots of new hardware to use vCenter 7. They've got 6.5 or 6.7, and they wanted to do migrations between the two, and this is something basically that you will see. Now, quite simply, this is actually telling me that the existing virtual machine is running on a CPU which has newer instructions than the CPUs that are currently in our EE Training Data Center. The Dell PowerEdge R730 uses Sandy Bridge generation, and our other lab uses Haswell. So it is not possible to actually migrate a machine between two completely different CPU generations. It's just not possible. However, there is a mechanism around the issue, and this is where VMware have actually basically created VMware EVC that allows you to set a consistent set of CPU features in clusters so that you can migrate in real time, powered on, between the machines, between the clusters. So I knew that was going to happen, and I'm going to show you, because there's a newer feature that we have now whereby we can create an EVC per VM. We don't have to actually set it per cluster. We can actually set it per VM. So I'm going to show you how we do that. So I'm just going to cancel out of this, and we would go to configure of the virtual machine. So this is vNAS build, that one that we were trying to migrate, and I'm going to go to VMware EVC, and it's currently telling me that EVC is disabled. Now, we can't allocate an EVC baseline to a powered up VM. It's quite simple. It has to be off. If you think about it, the virtual machine at the moment is powered on, and it is currently using the CPU in the host, and it is actually using all those instructions. So there's no way that we can replace that CPU in real time and expect the actual host, the guest machine, to carry on running without actually crashing. So I'm actually going to shut down this virtual machine. Here you can see this is DSM 7.1 on our Synology NAS. So I'm just going to shut this down. It's telling me the NAS will power off, and I'm just going to wait for this to actually power down. And once it's powered down, I'm going to configure that EVC baseline. Traditionally, you'd have to do this on the whole cluster. I can't do it on the whole cluster because I've got a whole suite of virtual machines currently running on it. Okay, so our NAS is off. So now that allows me to go back to configure VMware EVC, and I can click edit. And I can click enable EVC for Intel hosts, and I can select a CPU mode. Now I know, because I'm a bit of a geek and a nerd, that the current CPU generation in our Dell PowerEdge R730 is Sandy Bridge. So I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to power back on that virtual machine. So that virtual machine now is actually running under an EVC baseline of Sandy Bridge. So it thinks that it only has access to the Sandy Bridge instructions. So it's a bit like a hybrid. Yes, it thinks it's got an Intel Haswell or Skylake processor that's currently in use, but it's got that EVC baseline applied to it, so it can only use the Sandy bridge instructions. And I'm hoping if I just do a refresh here that shows. There we go. I'm going to log back in, NAS admin, special password. So that shows there that the NAS is running without issue. So, and it's running here. So again, I'm going to go back, basically going to do our migration. Cross vCenter. I want to keep the VMs on the source. I saved that from before, so I don't need to. I'm going to specify our host. Now, can you now see that it actually turns around and says compatibility check succeeded? So the EVC baseline on our source VM, VNAS build, is okay with the destination host, and I'm going to click next. Now, I do know that we're going to later on basically get into a little bit of an issue, and I'm going to show you that because it does happen. So now we're going to basically select our data store. So I'm going to select our spinning Rust data store. It's telling me that data store does not match the current VM policy because we're running on a vSAN build in the other lab, and I wouldn't worry about that too much at the moment. And I'm going to click next. That's the data center that we want to be in. So at the moment, the vMotion is being checked all along the way. I get a lot of questions that turn around and say, how do I know vMotion is going to work? vMotion is binary, really. It's a 1 or a 0. It either works or it doesn't work. But the ability to vMotion a VM, a guest VM, from one server host to another host or across data centers is checked all the way. So followed by next. Now it's actually going to tell us, and it's actually telling me I've got compatibility warnings here, and it's just telling me that the virtual machine uses network VM network. Well, really all that's actually doing is comparing, matching like for like networks. It doesn't really know whether or not that VM network on this particular cluster is the same as the VM network on the source cluster, and in fact it's not, because of the way that the allocation is done here across the labs. This lab that we're migrating to, the EE data center lab, is in a completely different network that doesn't have any access to the previous network. So technically I'm going to have to do some more fettling with this virtual machine when I've actually got it on the EE data center network to get it to work. So I'm going to click next. Schedule motion with high priority, and I'm going to click next, and I'm going to click finish. Now I know in advance this is going to fail, and I'm going to show you why it fails. So I'm going to click finish, and in the real world, okay, and it's got to 15%, and basically it's failed. Now the reason why that it's failed is because this particular virtual machine is not really pucker. It's got a few homebrew modifications in it, and it can't quiesce the virtual machine. VMware tools can't quiesce the virtual machine, and the whole process of a vMotion is based on a snapshot, and if it can't snapshot the virtual machine properly, it's gonna fail. So in that particular case, in that example, our vMotion failed. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to our virtual machine, and I'm going to shut it down. So as I was saying before, we're going to do a cold migration. We're not going to do a hot migration, which is a vMotion. We're now going to do a cold migration. Therefore, no snapshotting is required. No EVC build is required either. So I'm just going to wait for that machine. Okay, so we're powered off. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to go back to configure again, because we don't need the EVC baseline, because we're going to do a cold migration here now. Okay, so I've removed the EVC baseline. So we're now going to attempt to do the migration again. So I'm going to do cross vCenter export, keep VMs on the source. that was saved. EE Training Data Center, and select the host, followed by next, followed by Rust, followed by next, followed by next, followed by next, and now I'm going to click finish. Now things are a little bit different, and as you can see here now, it's cloning the virtual machine, vNAS build 45%. If we have a little look in our data center here, this is the E Training Data Center, the vCenter 7 on our Dell PowerEdge R730. You can start to see here that we've got vNAS build sitting here, which is being migrated, cold migrated, not technically a vMotion, a live migration, because the machine's powered off. And that's at 45%, and it shouldn't take too long to move them across the network here. 10 gig backed by vSAN and SSDs. Now you're probably looking at all these horrible error messages that I've got here. Now that's because I've been fiddling with this other lab to temporarily lever in a vMotion network that's able basically to talk to this vMotion network in the EE data center lab, and at the moment those are failing because it's actually reaching out across the wrong vMotion interface. So I'll let that tick on in the background there, and while that's actually occurring, I'll waffle on and explain what we've done. So in summary, we have created and made sure that the vMotion networks on our two standalone vCenter server infrastructures can communicate with one another, and I've showed you using vmkping and ping how we can actually clarify and check that we've actually got communication between the two. I've showed you how to live migrate vMotion, a server, from one standalone vCenter server to another standalone vCenter server, and demonstrated that unless you actually configure that EVC baseline, if you've got different generation CPUs, you can configure a cluster or you can configure a per VM EVC baseline. I then showed you that we could have migrated it, but due to technicalities with the VMware tools in this particular virtual machine, it would give us issues. And then finally, I've actually showed you how we can clone or migrate across the thing, across servers. So if I actually go back and look in here now, we've got vMNAS build, and just checking that I've still got this. So I'm going to power up this version here. These are all going to fail, and I'm going to look at that in a bit later and fix those. And I'm going to basically just check that I can power on this particular machine. Now this is in a completely different network, so it isn't going to be able to reach the other network, and it's not going to cause me any issues, and I'm going to have to re-IP this particular build to actually basically get to communicate correctly within this network here, because this network here runs on 192.168.182.0, subnet mask 255.255.255.0. The other network is completely different. So that seemed to be running, and I'm just going to do a quick refresh and see whether or not that appears to be okay. Now remember, this is our original machine. This isn't the new machine, because I'm going to have to actually do some changes in this particular machine to actually basically get it to run correctly. Okay, so 20 minutes. Okay, I said it was 10, it's 20 minutes. Anyway, this is the start of, we're going to start getting into more hosts, we're going to start getting into NFS. I'm going to show you later how we configure NFS on a Synology. If you're lucky, I'm going to show you how to configure iSCSI on a Synology NAS, although iSCSI is not really my favourite today. And then we're going to start looking at clusters and vSphere DRS, and we're going to start adding some more hosts into our cluster, so we can start looking at some more interesting things within VMware vSphere. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. As always, it's been a pleasure, and you take care out there. All the best now. Goodbye.